up the vocal cords, a little bit of coffee. All right, we are ready. Here we go. Welcome, game developers, to the Indie Game Lunch Hour. Joining us today is Kate Edwards on game design that crosses cultures.
Indie Game Lunch Hour.
Thank you for that beautiful dancing gif, Misha. In our live magical podcast, we give game developers the chance to hear stories of breaking in from industry experts, as well as directly ask them questions about their areas of expertise in the second half of each episode. As always, I'm your host here, Willem Delventhal, the headmaster at the Indie Game Academy, and joining me today is Kate Edwards. She is the CEO of Geogrify, as well as CXO at SetJetters, and a traveler and a speaker. And today we are talking about game design that crosses cultures, an extremely interesting topic, especially in today's day and age. Welcome to the show, Kate. I'm excited to have you here. I'm excited to talk about game design. I'm a big game design dork. What are you having for lunch today?
I will probably have a protein bar today. I'm too busy.
I see. Are you one of those like matter-of-fact eaters? It's about the nutritional content and nothing else, or is it just brevity?
Yeah, I tend to be.
Okay.
I tend to be, unless I'm traveling. If I'm somewhere like I just got back from being in Morocco and the UK, so of course you're in somewhere like Morocco, you're gonna eat local cuisine and enjoy it.
I am a vegetarian, except for when I go somewhere cool and need to sample something interesting. Amazing.
Exactly.
What type of protein bar? Do you have a favorite?
I believe these are Costco ones.
Okay. Any particular flavor? Doesn't matter.
Oh yeah, chocolate peanut butter, easily.
Gotta be
the best.
100%. Awesome. Well, it is a pleasure to have you on the show, Kate. I am always interested in talking about game design in general. And then, of course, this maybe not growing. I mean, it's been around for a while now, but the concept of bringing design and how design changes in different cultures is super fascinating. I got the chance myself to go to IGDC for the first time, India's GDC. And it was really cool to sit down and hang out with my typical crowd, my junior game developers, my indie game developers, and see the differences between a US group of those people and an Indian group of those people. So I'm excited to hear what you have to say. As always, the first question on this show is for the origin story. So Kate, I would love to hear where you are today in the game industry and how you got there.
Yeah, well, thanks again for having me, and hi everyone. So yeah, this is my 32nd year working in video games, and so my background, I'm a geographer and a cartographer. That's where I came from, and so to kind of make it a little bit faster, the story, I basically ended up at Microsoft when I was doing my graduate school work. I'd finished my master's degree. I'm based in the Seattle area, and I was at the University of Washington, and I'd started my PhD, and that's when Microsoft called our department looking for a cartographer to work on a new product they were making, which later I would know is Encarta Encyclopedia, which you maybe too young. I don't know. You may have heard of Encarta. I don't know. It was basically the last major encyclopedia in digital form before Wikipedia showed up online. And it was a big product for Microsoft back from like the early 90s for about 10 or 15 years until Wikipedia dominated everything. But they asked me to make the maps. So I went over on a 6-month contract and I made about 400 or 500 maps, old bit maps, I made those for the product, and then I thought, okay, I'm done. I'm going to go back, finish my PhD. But then they had me keep working on other stuff. They said, well, hey, now we need your help on this. We need your help on that. And it was a year later, 1993, is when the Flight Sim 5.0 team reached out to me for some cartographic advice for that game. And that's pretty much where I pegged my start in the game industry in 1993, working on Flight Sim. But then the job evolved, and eventually I got a full-time position at Microsoft in a role that they basically said, make up the role. We'll tell you what we need you to do, but you can write the job description and we'll just hire you into it. So I called myself a geopolitical strategist because my job was to help all the mapping products at Microsoft navigate all the sensitivities, like how do you show Taiwan and how do you show Kashmir and how do you show all these other disputed areas of the world? And I could do that based on my background. So I'm like, yeah, that's fun. I can do that. But then as I was in that role, helping mainly the mapping products at Microsoft, I started getting questions from all over the company, including some of the nascent game projects at the time. This is all pre-Xbox, but they were starting to get into the game space. There were a lot of PC games like the Mech Warrior series and Asheron's Call, and of course Age of Empires and games like that. So I started working on some of those because they were coming to me with all these kind of geography and culture questions. But then eventually, in 1997, we had this big faux pas that we did on the map in Encarta that really pissed off the South Korean government. And we fixed the problem, but it caused the government to go through like Encarta and a bunch of other products looking for errors. And they had this big long list of things that we needed to change. We didn't change everything. We changed a few things that were actual mistakes. The rest of it was just political or cultural opinion. But then, so we said, okay, that's resolved. The government's happy now. 3 months later, Age of Empires, the very first Age of Empires came out, and we had a Korean scenario in the original Age of Empires that contained some content that was similar to what we changed in Encarta, but we did not change it in Age of Empires. And why? Because Age of Empires was made in Dallas, Texas by Ensemble Studios. Encarta was made in headquarters in Redmond. They had no reason to talk to each other. They had no reason to know each other even existed. So when Age of Empires released, the South Korean government basically just lost it. They were super upset at Microsoft because it's all one label, Microsoft, but they don't realize there's all these big silos in which people work and they don't talk to each other. But that gave me the idea, we need a way to make sure this doesn't happen again. So I wrote a proposal to create a new team at Microsoft that I called Geopolitical Strategy. And it took me 7 months to get the team approved. I had to go through 5 different VPs. So I pitched to my own VP. They rejected it. Went to 4 or 3 others. They all rejected it. They thought it was a cool idea, but they're like, we don't need this. And then finally, someone said, hey, go talk to Paul Moritz. He might be open to this. So I talked to Paul Moritz April 7th, 1998. I'll never forget that morning. And I pitched the idea to him. In 2 minutes, he approves it. He's like, wow, we need this. Let's do it. And I think the main reason that happened is because Paul Moritz was the only VP I talked to who was not from the US. He was from South Africa. So he instantly understood the importance of making sure that we account for geopolitical and cultural sensitivities in our content. So my team was created, and then for the next 7 years, I basically instituted all these policies across the company, and that's when I formally started working on all the games. Up until that point, I'd been kind of nudging the games folks, hey, you really should be doing this more proactively because we're getting in trouble and you're dealing with a lot of content that's sensitive, or whether it's cultural representation, whether it's the use of history and other elements. And so finally, once the team was created, that gave me a lot of inroads to work more on the games. And so that's really when I formally started working on everything, all the Halos and Age of Empires and Fable and Forza and pretty much every game that Microsoft made back in those days in the early, the original Xbox, and then on to the Xbox 360. And then I, in 2004, was able to get the company to add this cultural and geopolitical accountability to their master checklist, because every piece of software that leaves Microsoft has to go through the checklist and be able to check every box. Most of the checklist is just legal or technical requirements, but I got a line item for geopolitical and cultural accountability, which of course pointed to resources that my team had created internally. And so once that was in that checklist, I felt my job is done. I don't need to do anything else. I basically institutionalized this at Microsoft. So I left by the end of March in 2005 to create Geogrify and be a consultant, and with the intention of pretty much working on video games, which has been the case for the last 20 years.
Wow. What a, one of the things that I love about doing this show, and I'm so grateful to be doing this show, is because I get all these little pockmarked pieces of video games as a whole and their history. First of all, had no idea that Age of Empires was a contentious release and that South Korea was upset about it. Like, how cool is that? I absolutely remember adoring and playing that game, but I think at that time I was young enough that, I wasn't looking at the global sphere. And I also just love, you never really know all of the different fields, professions that go into game development. And I often like to, one of the earlier lectures I often give to my own students is just how many different disciplines and how many different minds go into a video game these days. And I think this right here is a perfect example. I don't think any junior dev is okay, I need my game designer, my engineer, and my geopolitical strategist, you know?
No, it's not typical. I mean, and somebody, Rick mentioned Laura Fryer. Yeah, I worked alongside her back in the day. It was
Wow.
great working with her back in those days.
Wow. I mean, how wonderful. So, next, I would like to just say thank you because, man, I love so many of the franchises that you helped give life to, that I'm sure you made richer worlds as a result of your work. Age of Empires, the Halo series, of course, Forza, even, although I didn't play that one quite as much. So, thank you.
Yeah.
How cool is that? Wow. I guess so. The topic that you gave us, that you proposed to us for this show, was game design that crosses cultures. So I assume that part of what you want to talk about here is, basically how to create something that touches not just a US based market and works for people who are not just US based players. So I would love your kind of intro 101 to that concept. Yeah.
Yeah, so basically, this is what I call culturalization. So I started using that term after I left Microsoft because I wanted to differentiate from localization, which typically, when you hear localization, that usually means language translation, which obviously that's important. I mean, that's a really important thing if you're going to be, especially if a heavy text-based game, localization of the text is really critical if you want to distribute globally. And I recommend, I worked with a lot of indie devs. I've done a lot of pro bono work over the years with indie devs. But one of the key things I've always recommended to them is you can do nothing else, because I realize how hard it is just to get the game done, let alone think about international and cultural adaptation. But if there's one thing that I would recommend is see if you could at least do a localization into Spanish. Because especially Latin American Spanish, because if you're based in the US, for example, I mean, you've got at least a third of the country speaks Spanish. So even within the US, it opens a lot of doors in terms of accessibility. But then it also basically opens up your game to the entire Western Hemisphere, minus Brazil, because that's Portuguese. Mm-hmm. But for the most part, I mean, it's opening up an entire side of the world to your game potentially. And of course, in Spain, Castilian Spanish, even though it's a bit different from Latin American Spanish, they'll still be able to understand it for the most part. So that's one thing. And they're like, well, I can't afford somebody to do translation. It's like, well, there's a lot of people who work who do translation work, or even students who are bilingual who are say, hey, I'm willing to do the localization. Just make sure, if you can't pay them, at least give me credit. Make sure my name isn't there as the localization, whatever title you want to give them. So basically there are ways to do it. But beyond localization, it's about culturalization is about everything else. It's like, what about the character design? What about the environments? Where does the game take place? Is it a fantasy world? Is it a real world? If it's based in the real world, you have to think about issues like authenticity and accuracy. Like, are we representing things correctly? Are we representing cultures authentically? And how do you do that? One of the games I worked on more recently was the Indiana Jones and the Great Circle game, and spent a tremendous amount of time on that game working on helping them with the historical and cultural accuracy within that world, because of course it's Indiana Jones, so it takes place in the real world. You've got the Vatican, you've got the Giza Plateau in Egypt, you've got the Sukhothai ruins in Thailand. And so I had to bring into the project archaeologists from Egypt and Thailand, and had geologists working with me, and everything was about making sure everything you see in that game is accurate, because it had to be. Because players are going to scrutinize the crap out of it. They're going to freeze frame everything. Even the hieroglyphs. So if we had like a fictional part of the narrative that had to be on a wall that Indiana Jones finds, we made sure that the Egyptologists did an accurate translation into hieroglyphs or hieratic script. So the attention to detail was extreme. And of course, we kept joking during that project that we're pretty confident that game is far more culturally accurate than any of the films have ever been. But that's the amount of time and work that you do. And, and if you have a fantasy world, there is also the issue of, allegory, because a lot of times we will use inspiration from the real world to develop an in-game culture in a fantasy world. Like maybe they're based on Europeans, maybe they're based on, if it's a desert culture, almost every desert culture I've ever seen in a fantasy world looks like what? They look like Bedouin from the Arabian Peninsula. And that's almost without exception. And yet that is an allegory that you're using to say, well, they kind of look like that culture, but then you have to do what I call allegorical distance. You do the creative work to make sure that it's not too obvious that what you're representing in the game is also a direct representation of a real world culture. Now, maybe you want them to be. If that's the case, that's fine. But if you don't want them to be, you have to put in more creative work to kind of build that allegorical distance so that the in-game representation is not so obvious to the real-world inspiration. So, but we also deal with tremendous amount of issues around cultural appropriation as well, and cultural equivalency, as I call it. So with cultural appropriation, of course, you have a lot of issues where game designers are frequently using designs, especially from indigenous cultures, because so many indigenous cultures have designs that are so unique and they're so new and different to people, where it makes total sense why a lot of designers will lean into looking at indigenous designs and kind of using those in some way. But of course, because they're indigenous designs, you could use those as the start of your inspiration. But if you don't do the work to make your design sufficiently different, then you do run the risk of being basically culturally appropriating their design or practices or whatever else you might be drawing from that culture. And I've also worked on games where we had to deal with the issue of what I would say is cultural equivalency, where, like, for example, Jade Empire, which was one of the earlier BioWare games, because I've worked with BioWare on all of their games since then over the last 20 whatever years. But Jade Empire, what I loved about that game is that the whole intent was to make a fantasy world based on Asian medieval culture, because pretty much every fantasy property we see is based on what? It's based on European medieval culture, with European style armor and weapons and castles and all that kind of stuff. Game of Thrones, Lord of the Rings, you name it, just go down the list. There's so many that emulate European medieval culture. But Jade Empire said, we're going to make a fantasy game based on Asian medieval culture. But one of the problems they did with the original design of the game is they wanted inspiration from Korea, Japan, China, and India, and they put them into this world and they kind of blended them all together. So you were seeing different, like, iconic elements from the different cultures kind of mixed up in a way to create this unique culture. But it was a really kind of an inappropriate approach, because basically it's ignoring the uniqueness of each one of those cultures and the unique culture into itself. So mixing, and especially they were kind of blurring over the extreme cultural and geopolitical sensitivities that exist between some of those places. Like the cultural dynamic between China, Korea, and Japan is pretty delicate, I'll put it that way. So you have to be very careful about how you mix those elements, or if you mix them. So what we did instead, rather than mixing the elements to make one singular culture within the fantasy world, we basically made different realms within the world of Jade Empire. So that realm felt more Indian, that one felt more Korean, and so on, so that we didn't get accused of kind of blending and making ourselves look kind of stupid, like, oh, we don't know what culture this is from, so we're just going to mix it all together. I'm going to stop talking for a sec, though, but I hope that gives some idea of the complexity of this and kind of the layers of things you need to think about. I mean, even on something like a dancing game, like I've worked on Dance Central, the whole series, and I'm looking at the game for gestures and body language to see, because as they have the avatars dancing to the music, they're using gestures and doing different body movements that can be problematic in different cultures. Like many of them use the thumbs up gesture, which in some countries is the same as the middle finger. So we have to be mindful of that kind of thing.
So fascinating. So this is you can definitely see the complexity here pretty obviously. There are so many different stumbling blocks, and I think that's very natural. And it's one of the reasons I would hazard a guess that so many indie devs especially, but developers period, target a US market and kind of leave it at that. Maybe they localize, but that's as far as they really give it any thought. Because there's 7 billion people on the planet. Are we at 8 billion now? I think we are.
Yeah, somewhere around there.
Yeah, there's 8 billion people on the planet. And so, of course, many of them have different perspectives, different relationships to different symbology. And it's really easy to potentially upset or alienate, a potential audience. I'd love to hear, I have a couple of questions, follow-up questions from this. it strikes me that on the last week we talked with a guy named Eric Betancourt, who what he does is he puts together D&D campaigns. He's a professional DM specifically for people on the autistic spectrum.
Mm.
And so that was a pretty interesting conversation. And one of the things that he talked about was the depth of world building and how much that can really matter to all players, but in this case, for him, his players. And it strikes me that what you sort of are is a world builder or a narrative designer that's focusing on world depth from the
Mm.
lens of the real world. Would you consider yourself somewhere in the sort of narrative department or narrative realm?
I would to a certain degree. I mean, I still, I'll always identify as a geographer because
Hmm.
I'll proudly wear that label. But at the same time, what I have often told, my clients, I said I'm a world building partner. I mean, because I do work closely with the narrative teams, but I also work very closely with the design teams and art teams and others. Because it's always about when I start on a project. The best time that I'm brought in a project is as early as possible, because what I do is I sit down with the narrative team and with the producers and whatnot, and I read the early version of the script. I look at all the concept art. I kind of get a sense what I need to know. And I just told a new client this earlier this week. I need to know, what world are you building? Who's in it? What happens there? What kind of cultures are there?
Hmm.
What's the story being told? And very importantly, what is the player's agency in that story? And what's the player's role in that world? What are they going to be capable of doing or not doing as they interact with all of this in-game culture? Because the more I understand the world that they're trying to build, and more importantly, the intent behind the world, what is this world for? Which typically the world is there to support a story and a narrative that they want to convey in the player experience. But the more I can understand all of those details, the more I can help them, even at a very early stage, start course correcting and say, hey, I think that particular aspect may not work in this region, or it may not work in this culture, and here's why. Now, they, of course, they're the creatives, and so they have full creative license and decision making. I'm not their overlord. I'm a consultant. So it's like, I don't tell them what to do. I just advise them and say, hey, if I were you, if this is your goal, if you want this game to go as far as possible, you want to maximize the global reach of your game, this is what I would recommend. But if you don't want to do that, that's totally fine. That's your creative choice. And I'm a very strong believer in freedom of speech and freedom of self-expression. And games are an artistic art form that deserves that kind of recognition, and it's slowly gaining that kind of recognition on a global scale. So I'm there to support that, and whatever their goals are as a creative, and the more they can be explicit to me about what their goals are with the game, the more I can help them and kind of guide them on what might be the right course of action when it comes to the cultural representation.
Really interesting. All right. So my next follow-up question, you mentioned a couple of potential stumbling blocks here. So somebody may wind up accidentally culturally appropriating. Somebody may not be thinking about their cultural equivalences. Somebody may not be thinking about the cultural dynamics between even mythical character sets if they are based on something in the real world. From your perspective, especially for those indies, since that's who we serve on this podcast primarily, what are some of those really common stumbling blocks, or your cautionary tales? What can you avoid, and how can you maximize some of what you do, even just on that that small scale indie team of like 5 folks?
Yeah, well, there's generally what I see is there's 5 categories that I often have highlighted in a lot of my lectures. That the 5 ones that are ones where you have to think a bit more carefully about how you're going to represent them. I mean, one is history. So if you're well, let's say if your game is based in the real world, you're already bringing on a certain set of additional constraints, and I mentioned some of those earlier. About now, you have to think about, are we going, how authentic are we going to be? How abstract are we going to be? You can take an approach like, Grand Theft Auto is a world that I would call hyper-real, where it's not reality, but like Grand Theft Auto 5, everybody knows it's Los Angeles, but it's an allegory for Los Angeles. It's a one step out of reality. So they create Los Santos, and now they have full creative license to do anything they want to LA. I'm originally from LA, and I think what they did is phenomenal. I think it is such a fantastic representation of the city in such a great kind of satirical way. And I love what they did. I really do. So that's that's one approach as well. And in some some creative properties do that, like like DC and the MCU are very well known for creating countries, Wakanda, Sokovia, things like that, because that's their way of saying, oh, hey, we're going to have this fictional culture and action, but it's going to be set in the real world. But don't worry where it is. It doesn't really matter. It's just the fact that it's a fictional culture. So now we just kind of make up all kinds of stuff around it. And that serves their purpose really well. So history / real world. If you're going to deal with real world history, you have to be very careful, because a lot of cultures, the way they see their history, they're very, very attached to their history, especially because it's hard for us in North America because our history is so short, at least the European influenced side of the history of North America. Obviously, the indigenous side is ancient, but the European side is very young. I mean, we're talking 300 years or so. So we have to be very mindful of that. That in other cultures, especially in Asia, it's like their collective memory goes back millennia. The other one is anything around faith. So if you're going to represent anything related to faith, whether it's a real world faith system or if you're creating a faith system in the game, you have to, like if it's a fantasy world or something else, you have to be very careful about what are you basing it on? I mean, for the great majority of games I've worked on where they created a faith system, it's almost always starts with Catholicism. They use some form of Catholicism as a baseline because it's kind of obvious the orthodoxy and the practice that comes with Catholicism. And it's the ritual and the practice that kind of translates into the game, saying, oh, this seems like it's a religion because people are doing certain actions and they're saying certain chants or they're doing some kind of ritual-like behavior. But anything related to faith, you have to be extremely careful about, especially if it's a fictional one, because oftentimes, again, we start with a faith system and we use it as an allegory to build our own. So we have to be very careful not to mimic something too closely. And I've got so many examples for all of these, but I'm not going to give examples because we don't have time for that. The other one I would say is geopolitical issues, which is mainly maps. So again, real world based. If your game's set in the real world, if you have a map, like a world map or regional map that appears, you have to be really careful about what map you're showing. Because, for example, if you have the map of Central Asia that shows Kashmir, the northern part of India, if you're not showing, and if it has political boundaries, if you're not showing those political boundaries the way India wants it, they will insta-ban your game. They don't care about anything else. If that one map, even if it appears in your game for 5 seconds, is like kind of a overarching locator map, they'll ban your game like that. Just like China will as well for the same issue if you're not showing it their way. So maps can be super tricky if they're real-world maps. Another one, of course, probably the biggest one, is human representation. So obviously this is where we get into ethnic representation, gender representation, orientation, all of these different factors around how we represent human beings, or, what are, humanoid-like beings. That's a big issue where we deal with, all the kinds of forms of demographic representation and what that means to your game and how you want to represent that, if it's a fantasy world or real world. So there's a lot of factors around human representation, which also leads into what I would say is the probably other category, which is the cultural appropriation / intercultural tension, as I would call it, where if you represent something a certain way, and represent a certain culture or highlight a certain culture in your game, whether it's a real world culture or it's a fantasy culture that is, it appears to be like a real world culture. So there's not enough allegorical distance there. That can be an issue, because then we get a lot of issues around equity. And I've seen this happen over and over again, where they say, well, hey, why did you highlight that culture? And why did you give them so much attention, but you didn't give our culture, or there tends to be a sense of inequity that happens in the player base, but also sometimes across the different markets, where they're saying, well, hey, you pay so much attention to them, but not to us. So you have to be a little bit mindful of that, depending on which culture you are representing. And I know that sounds a little bit vague. I apologize, because the devil gets into the details. But I don't want to spend. I don't want to just kind of launch into full lecture mode right now.
No, this is perfect. So I heard those 5 that you're saying to check for. I heard historical, real world, faith, geopolitical issues, and human representation. Is there one that I missed from that list?
Well, I would say cultural appropriation, kind of the cultural appropriation issues, which is kind of related to human representation. But I would also say it's a larger aspect of just general cultural representation, because usually cultural appropriation does not deal as much with the actual human representation. It deals with the elements around cultural representation. So artifacts, even on human beings, tattoos, jewelry, symbology, costumes, folk costumes that they wear, things like that.
Okay, so now I'm going to ask, I've got one more question before we move on to community questions. We've got a couple of good ones in the chat. So this is, I think, one of the bigger questions for somebody who is not convinced. For all those upper level executives that you tried to get to start your geopolitical strategy group at Microsoft, why is this important? Give me some of those like practical reasons and maybe beyond that as well.
Well, there's a few reasons. I mean, one is that, the most fundamental one, and I kind of already used the phrase, it's actually a phrase I use for my business, but, I think all of us, whether we're indie or AAA, it doesn't matter. We spend our lives and our souls making these games. They are works of passion and art. And we honestly, when we're done with them, if, done as possible, we want as many people around the world to enjoy them. I mean, I think generally speaking, we don't make this just for a certain group of humans to enjoy. We make it for everybody to enjoy, and we would love everybody to share in our vision and share in our work. And I think that's really critical, that if we really want to maximize our creative vision around the world and share it with as many people as possible, there does need to be this notion of, are we being globally inclusive? Now, when we talk about inclusivity and diversity, which are very important topics we can talk about, but when I say inclusivity, I don't just mean from an ethnicity standpoint or gender or things like that. I mean, those are all important aspects of inclusivity, but to me, I'm also thinking about broader global inclusivity, which means cultural and geographic and faith and political and all these other forms of inclusivity, all these aspects and dimensions of what makes us human beings. Because the physical traits, yes, they're important, but it's also the cultural traits that also make us who we are. And so I think thinking about it, I want to be as globally inclusive as possible. How do I do that? I want as many people around the world to enjoy my game. How do I do that? And so oftentimes that means with the culturalization process, we're making little tweaks. Typically, and I have so many examples of this, but usually culturalization is very surgical. It's not like we're looking at the whole idea and we're saying this whole idea is bad. That almost never happens. Usually when I'm doing my work, it's very surgical. It's like this one thing. Don't use this symbol. Don't design this one character that way. Don't include this one particular part of the narrative because it might be sensitive in this market. But generally everything else is fine. Good example is Fallout 3. When I worked on Fallout 3, everything in that game I thought was pretty much fine except one thing. And there was a two-headed Brahmin bull that was wandering the post-apocalyptic landscape of Fallout 3. And the Brahmin bull is sacred to the Hindu faith. And in India, they have laws that protect real Brahmin bulls from being harmed. And there was enough concern that those laws would apply to the virtual representation of this mutated radioactive Brahmin bull. And so we went back to Bethesda and said, hey, can you guys just swap it out for something different, like a two-headed horse or something that's not going to be sensitive? And they said, well, no, we're not going to do it because we don't have time. We don't want to break the build, et cetera. And at the time they said, well, we don't think India is important enough as a market to do that, which of course today they would not make that decision because India happens to be one of the fastest growing game markets in the world. So basically, because of that one issue, just one two-headed Brahmin bull, that's the reason that Fallout 3 did not sell in India ever.
Wow.
So that it's very surgical like that. So that's the thing. It's like, so what would have happened? So that kind of leads to my second point about why this is important. It's not just about respecting the culture of the players and maximizing the reach of your creative vision. It's also maximizing revenue, because by not changing that one visual element in the game, they basically left behind all of the potential revenue that could have come from India for Fallout 3. And so the more you can make sure that the game is viable in different cultures and different markets, the more potential, revenue that you might be able to get out of all of your hard work.
Yeah, so it is a that to me, it does absolutely feel like there's a practical side to this and a more like emotional, I guess, side to this. Practical side is just like, hey, if you don't do this, you're leaving potential money on the table. And man, we put a lot of work into this game. It would be great if we got more money for it. And then I think that more emotional or spiritual or like integral side is just we make games for everybody, and it would be a shame if we happen to do something that we didn't realize excluded a certain population of players that we would love to be playing our games and love to be playing our art form. Does that feel like an accurate summation?
Yes, I would say so.
Amazing.
Yeah, and it's not easy. I mean, that's the thing. It's just like, I don't do this work because I want to maximize people's revenue. I do it because I want to maximize cultural respect. I want to respect who plays our games and who they are and the unique people and cultures that they represent. The whole maximize your global reach idea came from me trying to convince, especially executives, that this is important work to do. And I found that I had to change my language a little bit in order to get them to understand. So I had to use language that sounds like the possibility of maximizing revenue. And of course, when you say that, the eyes light up and say, well, yeah, we want to do that. I'm like, yeah, I'm sure you do. That's not why I do the work. That's not what motivates me to do this work. But I'm glad that I found a way to kind of help them understand that this is important to do. Because the end result is the same. They're still going to lean into the culturalization and say, yeah, we should do this. They want to do it for the money. I want to do it just to make sure that the creative vision is shared with as many people as possible.
And that is, I think, also sort of the most virtuous place to find yourself, especially as a contractor or somebody who's contributing to a project. It's wonderful to be able to both make them more money so the executives get it and do some good for the world. So thank you for what you do.
Yes.
All right. We are at the portion for community questions. I've got Petunio up on stage here. Petunio actually has 2 questions. Generally, we only do 1 per person, but I think they're both great questions. So Petunio, take your pick. What do you want to start with?
Hi, thank you for having me.
Yes.
So there seems to be a lot of pitfalls to this, using countries and all these things. Isn't it easier to just make up countries? Like DC Comics has Kurak for a stand-in for a Middle Eastern country, or Santa Prisca for like a Central American country. Is it just easier to just make up stuff?
Generally, I would say it is. But a lot of narrative folks, that's not what they want. I mean, especially if they have a game set in a real world. Like I've worked on a lot of first-person shooters like Call of Duty and Battlefield and things like that. And they want like gritty authenticity. They want it to feel real. They want something like Black Hawk Down, where it's like, it feels real. It is real. You're in the midst of it. It's a real place, because that's honestly what a lot of their player base demands. They want something that is realistic. And so that's why, they lean into having the real world locations. But it's a challenge, because a lot of those types of games, they not only do it in the real world, they actually want it to be like in a disputed area, an actual disputed area in the real world, where I'm just like, no. I mean, come on. It's like, that's where it gets a little tricky, and that's where I would advise, okay, well, if you want to do it in the real world, that's fine. I mean, that comes with all of these different constraints we have to think about, but maybe we can make up a fictional dispute at least. Don't use a real dispute, because that just makes it a mess. You're going to have at least 2 markets that are going to be really upset that you're highlighting that particular area. But to your question, I would say yes. If it serves your narrative and your world building, I think generally it's better to just make a fictional place, especially if it's going to be in the real world. Just make up something fictional, because you're right. It works really well, in the context of like DC and MCU.
Yeah. Well, the second one is about exonyms and endonyms.
Yes.
I learned about it just like a very short time ago. Like, how Greece is, Greek people don't call Greece Greece.
Yeah.
German people don't call. Well, America has one. Like,
yeah.
We call ourselves Americans. Other people will call us United Stations, if you will.
Yeah.
What?
Right.
I haven't even heard that one.
Yeah, it's true. That's called a demonym. So it's demonym is the name that we call ourselves. So like in Mexico, they have a word for United States, which is kind of like what you said. It's sort of United Statesans in a way, because American, that bothers me, because American is a demonym that applies to anyone in the Western Hemisphere. We're all Americans in the Western Hemisphere, but unfortunately, the United States has co-opted that as their demonym, and unfortunately even more so, a lot of countries outside the US have reinforced that. But I have a lot of friends in Latin America who get pissed off when they hear, you know, this whole America is great and all that kind of stuff, because it's like, well, yeah, the whole Western Hemisphere, we're all great. That's right. You know, but this, speaking to endonyms and exonyms, I think the Gulf of America nonsense is a great example of that, because when that announcement was made, I'm a cartographer. I kind of shrugged and I said, okay, I don't see the reason for doing this, but I understand it, because, you know, it's very common around the world. So for people who don't know, an exonym is basically a name that's basically shared outside of a country. So a great example is the Sea of Japan. The name Sea of Japan is used pretty much universally around the world. The International Hydrographic Office, which is based in Monaco, basically kind of oversees. They don't treat the names really as official, but they're kind of the ones who say, yeah, that's generally the common name that we're all going to use. So Sea of Japan. But in Korea, they call it the East Sea, and they don't want to see the name Sea of Japan. They don't use the name Sea of Japan. In Korean, it's called Tonghae, but then in English, it's East Sea. So they will constantly, if you see a Korean map made in Korea, it'll say East Sea. And that is an endonym. That is the name used within Korea, by Korea, for that feature. And so when Trump announced that we're going to call it the Gulf of America, from a strictly objective cartography standpoint, I said all that the US did is declare that we now have an endonym. So our endonym is Gulf of America. That's what we're going to use. Gulf of Mexico is now an exonym, which it is, because that's what everybody else uses. Now Google Maps was very quick to change it, and a lot of people criticized them. But they were my first major client after I left Microsoft. I worked with Google as a consultant for 6 years. I created their geopolitical team, just like I did at Microsoft, and I helped them perfect what we call domain tailoring. So if you go to different internet domains, you will see different versions of the map, because that helps them basically create a map that the world can use, but it's going to be compliant with the different requirements in different countries, like how India shows their borders or how China shows their borders. So they instantly showed Gulf of America only for the US, they show Gulf of Mexico only for Mexico, and then the rest of the world sees it double labeled as exonym, Gulf of Mexico, and then parentheses, endonym, Gulf of America. And that is pretty much very standard cartographic practice. But yeah, the politics behind it is really messed up, but I'm just speaking objectively as a cartographer. It just makes sense.
Super fascinating.
No,
Yeah.
This is very fascinating. But yeah, thanks so much.
Well, Petunia,
Thanks.
do you want to follow up on that question? Because I think you had a little bit more to that, right?
It's pretty much answered, because I was wondering, how do they pick which one to use? You know, for like something like the Chinese don't call themselves, you know, they don't call that country China, they call it something else.
Yeah,
How do you pick?
Zongguo.
Yeah, the same thing like Turkey, they call it Turkey, and now like
Yeah.
lots of maps have that name too. So it's interesting that they ask nicely, you know, that sort of thing. Like it just
Well, they kind of assert, because part of it is that, you know, the ISO 3166 standard is the standard that oversees country and region names. So a lot of what the countries will do, the ones who want to change their name, like a great example is Ivory Coast in West Africa. So for many, many years, it was called Ivory Coast by the English name, but eventually the government asserted that no, we're going to use our French name, Côte d'Ivoire, and that is the only name that you're going to know us by. We don't want to see Ivory Coast. So they basically got it changed in ISO 3166. They got it changed at the UN. You know, Cape Verde, another country in Africa, they also did the same thing. They're called Cabo Verde. They want to use the Portuguese name, just like East Timor did the same thing. East Timor became independent several years back, but then after they achieved their independence, they changed the name to Timor-Leste, which is the Portuguese name for East Timor, because they don't want to use the English name. And so that is how they appear officially in the UN, in ISO 3166, and elsewhere. And so they basically, essentially, any country can do this. They can just assert it to the global stage saying, hey, we're known by this, which Turkey is a great example. They used the Turkish spelling of the name Turkey because they want to basically make sure that people see it as a more, you know, unique name, because otherwise it's the bird too, you know, Turkey the bird. And I think they want to kind of make themselves a bit more unique than that.
fantastic.
Amazing.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for the questions, Petunio. I have 2 questions here from Joker of Aces, who has asked me to ask for them. Joker asks, when selecting voice actors, Do I choose from the selected countries and cultures of specific characters? Would it be best to have them ad-lib lines to culturally correct speech and rewrite parts of the associated script?
That's a great question. I mean, there's a lot of times where I've been involved in voice actor selection to a certain degree. I mean, that tends to be a little bit more outside my domain, but oftentimes they'll come to me, and get some advice on who to select or why to select certain actors. That's always been a bit of a contentious thing because, as by nature, as actors, many actors are, they're awesome at doing accents, and they can do accents from people from all different parts of the world. There's some actors that are really particularly good at this. And so it's like, well, do you not use their acting ability because they're not from that place? And the answer is generally what we strive to do. We always strive to find an actor from that place and from that culture, which I think is always the right thing to do. Look there first. Can you find somebody from that place who can do the voice acting, who is, can do it well? And usually the answer is yes. I mean, pretty much anywhere you can find somebody from that place or from that culture or around that culture who is able to do a good accent that represent it. And it all depends, though, of course, because if we're doing like a hyper local accent, like the way that the UK has so many like ridiculously hyper local accents where they can tell, like, yeah, you're from a town 5 miles away, you're not from here. Some places are like that. So you might have to find somebody from that little tiny town 5 miles away. But generally speaking, you can find somebody who emulates it well enough. But we always start with somebody from the place. And then it's like, if we're not having any luck, then obviously you kind of expand out from there and say, well, is there somebody from the general area who might be able to do a good job? And then we just basically go from there. So yeah, sometimes that will change the script to a certain degree, depending on who you find. There have been a couple times where we just could not find a voice actor who we felt going to be authentic enough for that character. So the character was changed. So we said, well, who can we find? And is it going to matter that much to the narrative if we actually change the background of the character to be a little bit different? And so, so that's when, and that has happened a few times where they say, well, it's easier to change the character because we found this amazing voice actor and we really want to work with them.
That's really interesting. So first, if you can, somebody from the location. If you can't, somebody who can imitate as best as possible.
Yeah.
I love that. All right. I think we've got 2 more questions before we wrap it up. Second one here is also from Joker. Joker asks, in regards to mythology, do you recommend you find a way to state directly which culture you are referencing or inspired by, or do you leave it to the audience to figure it out?
That's a great question. I've worked on several games that involve mythology, including Age of Mythology, the original game, as well as Age of Mythology Retold, which I think was released last year. I don't remember. I always forget when the release happens because my work usually ends months before the game comes out, depending on the game. But it depends because, like in Age of Mythology is a good example where they basically have grouped the mythological. You play like as the Norse, since you deal with the Norse mythology kind of within its own self. Whereas then you have games like Smite where you actually have the different mythologies actually fighting against each other. If you haven't seen Smite, where you've got like the Norse gods and the Egyptian gods and the Greek gods, all kind of fighting in a big MOBA. Unfortunately, they also added the Hindu gods in there, which really caused a lot of uproar in the Hindu community because they did not appreciate the fact that they leveraged, Hindu gods and put them into this game. So that's a great example of where they kind of crossed the line. Because you've got the Norse, Greek, and Egyptian gods are not worshipped by very many people anymore, just like very few. Whereas, the Hindu gods are worshipped by about 1.2 billion people. So they and it kind of led to a lot of jokes, that led to a lot of jokes about people saying, why don't you just get the game over with and throw in Jesus, Muhammad, and Moses and just make it a game about religious warfare, which I'm kind of glad they didn't. But anyway, with mythology, it really depends what it's going to serve in your game. I mean, if you want to make it more blatant, you can, but then you have to decide, well, how do you do that? I mean, you don't have like a Cyclops show up and say, well, hey, I'm Cyclops from Greece, and I'm going to beat the shit out of you.
That could be pretty funny, though.
Well, yeah, it could be. So you have to think about, really what does it serve? I mean, I like the idea of being more subtle about it because I love casual learning. I love when, players have to kind of figure it out, or they can go look it up on their own and say, hey, I just encountered this mythological creature. They could go Google it and say, oh, that's what that is. Oh, it's from Persia. That's really cool. So I don't really think you have to hit them over the head with it in terms of announcing where it's from, but I do think it needs to make sense why it's there and what role it's going to play. Because mythologies are mythologies, there's not necessarily like a huge stigma around mixing them a bit, but that's where you kind of walk carefully along that line between mythology and faith. And that's kind of why I made that distinction where you've got in Smite, where you've got 3 well-known mythologies versus a faith system, which is very active in this world. And so you kind of have to think about, is the mythology that I'm going to leverage, is it actually practiced by many people today? Is it something that people still adhere to, or is it just kind of in the realm of mythology? And especially when it comes to like creatures, if it's mythological creatures, they tend to be a bit more fair game as opposed to using deities. If you start using different deities from different mythologies.
Amazing. Awesome. All right. Last question of the day is from Rick. Rick is wondering about basically handling people who might get upset and where to cross that line. Rick, you want to ask your question?
Yeah. So I really love this idea of the allegorical distance. Like when you want to look out into other cultures and be inspired of them, take influence, all human creative expression is a remix of the creative expression of humans of the past. And it is important to be respectful and do your due diligence. So my question is here regarding when you have people on the team who are perhaps being overly vigilant, and like at what point do you say, hey, listen, we have enough allegorical distance that, what's the best way to draw that line and then make the case with everybody saying like, hey, listen, we have respectfully done our due diligence and now we have something that is really cool, but also takes inspiration from the cultures that exist in the world.
Yeah, that's a great question because I mean it really speaks to, when do you feel that you've done the work, you've put in enough work, and because I mean we could iterate on this stuff forever, which is why most of our games are never really done. But that's true of all creative media. They're never really done. I mean, if that was true, we'd never see a director's edition of a film. It's like the director's cut is because they weren't done when they had to hit the theaters. So, but I think to that point, I mean, one of the things that we always deal with in the calculus of it is, and in fact, I just gave a new talk this year about making games in a polarizing world. Or I said polarized, not polarizing. It's polarized already. But one of the things I bring up is kind of thinking of the calculus of, to what degree is it going to cause a reaction? And one of the things I have people do in the audience, and I have them repeat after me on the slide, says someone will hate my game, because they will. Because that's the world we live in. Somebody's going to hate something about what you do, and you just got to accept the fact that they hate it. And they may hate it because they don't like that genre. They might hate it because of your cultural representation, but they're going to hate it for one reason or another. And it's always about, is it 30 people who are complaining or is it 30,000 people complaining? And that's often the calculus we have to work through. I mean, I know that's constantly what I'm doing with AAA titles I work on. To what degree is this going to be a problem for people? And so if you feel you've done your work and you've built in it what you feel is enough allegorical distance, at some point you have to just call it done and say, this is good enough. We feel we've done the work. It's not exactly the same. Is it going to emulate or evoke the original concept? Yeah, possibly, but maybe we want that to a certain degree. But I think, this is where you have to think about the defensibility of our creative choices, because sometimes, we can lean into a potentially controversial subject. And I don't think people should avoid that at all, because, I mean, again, games are creative, forms of self-expression. We should be able to deal with controversial or problematic topics, just like film and literature and television and everybody else. So, but you just have to do it with eyes wide open. And so oftentimes when I'm working with a team that I know they did their work, but there still might be a potential risk exposure, we will sit down and basically write root Q&A, which is something from PR, where basically you're anticipating what are the questions we're going to get about this. So we will write out in advance, here's how we would explain this if somebody were to ask me this question, or if somebody was pissed off or somebody's offended, how would I respond to that? And usually when we've done the work, you can basically explain, you don't have to over explain. You just have basically a simple paragraph that says, we approached this because we felt it was important to our narrative, and we did the amount of work. We consulted with this resource and that resource, and basically determined that this is, this was the right direction for this character, or this was the right direction for this particular content element that's in our game, and that's it. And and I think at one point you have to agree with yourselves, we don't need to make an apologies for our own creativity. Especially if we've done what we feel is enough due diligence, then at some point we have to accept responsibility for it and be proud of what we've done, and just say, well, we didn't try and offend you, but if you're offended, we're sorry, but that wasn't our intent, and we did the work to do this. And at that point, it's like there's nothing more you can do, because people will choose to be offended no matter what in some cases.
That's a great answer. Thank you.
Yeah, that was actually really powerful. Thank you for that question, Rick, and thank you for that answer. All right, we are very much at the end of time. I was having too much of a good time. I've been
He booted himself. Well, I'm the host.
That's so funny. Hello. Before I popped off, I just said thank you for that question, Rick, and thank you for that answer. That was a really powerful one. I'm now going to boot you off stage, Rick. Thank you. And I think it's time for us to wind down for the day. I have taken a little bit more of your time than I should have, but it's just been such a good chat. Before we say goodbye, we'd like to do two things here. Number one, I'd love to assign some homework. So what is something that the audience can do in the next week or so that'll take them about an hour to practice some of what we talked about here today?
So there's a couple of things, and yeah, I'm going to find my I have to find my questions. Yeah, let me just find them. Sorry.
No worries.
Okay, here they are. So many games have made cultural faux pas over the years. So I'd like you to find at least one example of a game that was negatively affected post-launch because of a religious or faith-related issue. So it should not be that hard to find something. In fact, I actually gave you one just now earlier in this chat. I'm not going to remind you what it was. So think about, go out there and search and see, is there something, related to that, that why was there a game that got affected post-launch because of a religious or faith issue? That's one question. The other question I'm going to pose to you, because I also spent 5 years running the International Game Developers Association, and I spent 3 years running the Global Game Jam, because I do a lot of advocacy-related work in the game industry, because it's not just about doing my job, which I love, but it's also about wanting to make life better for game developers, because they need it, especially in the last year or two. It's been pretty crappy in this industry. So I'm very, yeah, I know. So the other question I will ask you to try to think about or look up is the Entertainment Software Association, the ESA, as well as the International Game Developers Association, the IGDA, were both established in 1994. So can you explain why these organizations arose at that time? So, it's probably a little bit of Google searching, but you'll be able to determine what was going on, especially in the United States at that time, that led to the creation of those two entities. So it's kind of an interesting background, a little bit about the history of at least the video game industry in the US.
Amazing. It was the ESA and which organization?
The International Game Developers Association, the IGDA.
IGDA, amazing. Awesome. So your homework then for everybody listening and those in the chat are twofold. Write out an answer for us. Find one cultural faux pas that another game released and received backlash from, and do a little bit of a mini case study on that. And then ask yourselves why the ESA and IGDA came around in 1994, and give us a little bit of a write-up on that. We would love to see, as always, if you are willing to share your homework on LinkedIn. If you do, you can tag us, the Indie Game Academy, as well as Kate Edwards and myself, Willem Delventhal, and we'll maybe stop by and say hi and say good job doing your homework. All right, before we say goodbye, we'd like to give you a little chance here. Kate, is there anything you would like to plug, and any last words of wisdom you would like to give?
Well, two quick things. One is, feel free to add me on LinkedIn. I'm very easy to find. If you have any follow-up questions about any of this stuff, I'm more than happy to talk about it. Forgive me if it takes a little bit to respond because things get pretty busy, but I will respond. So feel free to add me there. The other thing, which is my total side hustle, if you like visiting filming locations, I created an app during COVID called SetJetters. It's out on the iOS and Android store, and SetJetters is basically my hobby. When I travel so much to speak at events around the world, I like to visit where movies and TV shows were filmed because that's the kind of nerd that I am. So I created an app to help you do that. So if you're curious about it, feel free to check it out.
Beautiful. Awesome. This has been such a good episode. Kate, thank you for being here. Look up Kate Edwards on LinkedIn and send her a request. I know I'm going to be doing that myself in the next 30 seconds. Thank you for being here and for answering our questions and giving us some insight into this unknown world of game dev, at least to me.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for having me, and it's great to talk with you all, and thanks for all the great questions, too.
Absolutely, yeah. Thank you to everybody who asked a question, and for those who listened to the podcast. As always, we'll be here again in the Discord, 12 p.m. Eastern Time, every single Wednesday. If you enjoy this episode, my one request to you is that you share it around to just one other person that you believe would also enjoy learning from Kate. That would be tremendously helpful. All right, I think that's going to be it. Links will be down in the description if you'd like to join us or hear about any of the things Kate just mentioned. Thank you for your time, Kate. We'll see you again some other time.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye, everybody. Adios. And goodbye.